Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where we cultivate change from the inside out as we ponder the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impact social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with Inflection Point Podcast.
Well, hello, and thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of Inflection Point Podcast, where we are dedicated to anti-racism activation and the art of listening and authentic conversation and engagement and action and accountability. I am your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Howdy, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter, and thanks for coming.
Absolutely. So our theme for 2025 is community engagement and the grassroots of change. So throughout the year, we've been exploring stories and strategies and successes of community-driven movements that are making a difference. So our episodes have focused on both theory and practice, allowing our audience to gain insights that they can apply in real-world community engagement efforts. In this episode, however, we take a slightly different tact. And here we're going to explore the adverse impact of community disengagement, particularly through gentrification and specifically in the city of Pittsburgh. Both Gail and I are natives of Pittsburgh. It's our home city. So what we're going to do in this segment is present a concise Pittsburgh-specific deep dive that connects community engagement to the city's gentrification. And so if you're in our audience and you live in Pittsburgh, you probably understand what we're talking about, thinking about this whole idea of community disengagement and how that relates to the city's gentrification arc. Right? And so we're going to dive into this issue because it has shaped Pittsburgh's neighborhoods for generations, right? And as I mentioned, Gail and I both born and raised in the city of Pittsburgh, but the sort of the current situation is really related to this long history of policy that began with redlining and mid-century urban renewal. Then it shifted to anchor and philanthropically led redevelopment. And so that was a major shift. So if you understand the history of the city of Pittsburgh, it was a steel industry, right? That was like the number one thing, is that it was a steel industry. But what's playing out now, and this has occurred over the course of many, many years, going back to the 80s, quite frankly, but what has played out now is this tech-driven investment. But then on the other hand, we have weak tenant protections and uneven participation systems. So those systems that allow people in a city to participate and what is happening in their city, to participate in the growth of their city, the economics of their city. And so that cumulative effect has been population loss, particularly among Black residents. And I can actually attest to that because I was born, raised, and educated in Pittsburgh, but I left in the 80s. I came back in 2017. So that was like almost a 30-year gap where I did not live in the city of Pittsburgh. However, I did come back and visit. I had family, I had friends, and, all of those connections and everything was there. And so what was interesting to me was when I started to see how things were changing over the course of time, particularly with the growth of education, the universities around in the Pittsburgh area, and also sort of UPMC as like a huge investor, if you will, in the city of Pittsburgh. It's a health, it stands for University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And it's big. And one of the things that I noticed when I would come back and forth, we would come for vacations and holidays and all that sort of thing. And it just felt like every time I came back, UPMC was bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Which meant certain things that I may have been familiar with in my earlier life of living in Pittsburgh were starting to disappear. And I just remember like, oh my gosh, that building, it was this, and now it's something else. And so I was just kind of going back and forth. And then finally, I ended up coming back to Pittsburgh in 2017, relocating back here. And that's when I really got the full breadth of how much things had changed in the city, but it wasn't always changed for everybody. And it wasn't always good economic change. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, but I'm going to start out with a definition of gentrification. And gentrification is more than just a few buildings, a few new buildings here and there. It's really the process of wealthier individuals moving into historically disinvested, meaning that these are neighborhoods that were not a part of the overall investment scheme of the city. Right. And so what happens is often you're pushing out long-term residents because things are starting to get more difficult in terms of how the land values are changing, and that community disengagement begins to happen when people are tired of being left out of decisions and they kind of step back and leave the policy and the profit to run unchecked. And so when you think about, Gail's going to lead us into sort of this historical discussion of how that played out in the city of Pittsburgh and how it played out very dramatically in the city of Pittsburgh. So we're going to talk about the historical roots. We're going to talk about some of those current dynamics. And then we're going to talk about what are some of those thoughts on what real solutions could actually look like. Because when you think about it, all of this happens because you have one group of individuals who have a very different platform than another group of individuals. And when this group of individuals are in a particular community or they're occupying a certain land, and these particular individuals now want to take over that land, and now you end up with people who are displaced. And it has happened very, very dramatically in the city of Pittsburgh. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Gail, and she's going to walk us through this deep dive discussion of the history of Pittsburgh and how all of that happened, and mentioning some very specific communities that were impacted over the course of time. So take it away, Gail.
All right. Well, in Pittsburgh from the 1900s to the 1940s, it was a significant case study in industrial history and racial segregation, economic decline, and then rebirth, according to what they believed they were doing. It was very much of a booming steel town, and now it's turned into a very high-tech and healthcare hub that is but the racial inequalities of the past still remain deeply embedded in a lot of the neighborhoods. So during a lot of Black families came during the Great Migration and settled in Pittsburgh. And historically, the primary two areas that they settled in were the Hill District and Homewood. There are also a couple other areas too that they eventually settled into, and which I'll talk about in a minute. So what happened with redlining in the 1930s, and redlining was really when the government and the banking policies denied loans and mortgages to predominantly Black neighborhoods. And the Hill District was one of them. And so is Homewood. And I'll mention later about Larimer, which is another predominantly Black neighborhood now, but originally was not. Originally was mostly Italian. But because of redlining, these areas were set up for the ability to consider them hazardous, which meant they couldn't get the mortgage credit, and they became primary disinvestments that later became targets for clearance. And that's exactly what they did. In probably the most historic one is going to be the Hill District. The Hill District originally was a home to thousands of Black families in Pittsburgh. It emerged as a cultural and economic heart of Black Pittsburgh. It had vibrant jazz clubs, newspapers, and small businesses. And I have to say, personally, it was close before I became old enough to actually go there. But my older sister, who I have to say has always been a bit racist, would go there because she loved jazz. And it was that much of a prominent place for people to go in the Hill District, was to go to all the different places that they had not just August Wilson and who was a playwright, but a lot of different nightclubs and places that they had unbelievable people playing and performing there. So it was a hub for not just Black people, but even white people went there too. And then part of what happened was in the 50s and 60s, they decided to take this much of the lower hill, and because they had already set up for redlining, they used that to justify destroying it. And they wanted to build the Civic Arena, which is a big arena that they were going to use for a variety of different events. But when they did that, it was 95 acres that they demolished. 8,000 residents were displaced. 400 businesses were completely demolished. And it turned this community into a huge devastation. As you can imagine, they used to call it Little Harlem. As I said, it was very vibrant and a hot spot. There's a place called the Crawford Grill that was also very famous. But the construction began in 1955 and was completed around 1960, 61. As I said, they were at least 1,500 Black families, and which I said around 8,000 people. And the businesses, they were completely erased and never were able to be put back together. And not only that, but they then built an interstate right through 579, right through where the arena was now, and the parking areas, and that also cut them off even more so from the city. And so it took a toll on that in so many different ways. But can you imagine that many people having to find a new place to live who have been living there for their entire lives? Some people reference it as like it was like losing a trauma, that like losing a limb. But you had this phantom limb that the community continued to feel long after the steel industry shut down and into the close to 2000. So what happened then? They then decided to tear the Civic Arena down in the late 20th century, and and when they did that, they still have yet, and this was probably about 15, 20 years ago, they still have yet to, maybe 10, 15 years ago, they have not rebuilt that area. They promised the people in the community, because the community organized themselves and were really very insistent on being a part of the discussion and decisions that were going to take place to create this new area for the people that had been displaced earlier. And they turned down an architect and a designer from Boston, but nothing at this point has really been defined and let alone put into action. And what's there now are parking lots that were there when the Civic Arena was there. And so that's, which I think is just horrible, right? That with all the money that they've wanted to put into that area, and they did build a new facility that houses the Pittsburgh Penguins and other concerts that they can have there, but they have not really done that much to really begin to recreate that area and give back to the Hill District what was theirs. So that was one major area, and another area was in the East Liberty, and that probably. When they first put a circle of driving around the entire part of what that was, where the some housing was, and also a lot of stores were, and it was considered like a really top business area in Pittsburgh, but it started deteriorating, and they started to not be putting money into that area, and that closed down so many businesses because it really isolated people from being able to get to some of those stores. I mean, they had some major stores down there, and then they had small business owned by Black people that were there they're flourishing. And then, so that really deteriorated. And I lived actually close, right near the East End in 1985, and it had deteriorated so badly that there was a lot of crime that had increased. And again, the city was not doing anything to try to change this or to redo it. It has now since they've been trying to revitalize the East End, but what they've done is a gentrification. Originally, they were supposed to go in, the urban redevelopment program in Pittsburgh was supposed to include enough low cost housing for people, but they really didn't do that. They tore down 3 major towers of apartments for that mostly Black people lived in, and they tore them down. They did not replace them with any kind of low income housing. What they put there instead was a giant Whole Foods and some office buildings. So they didn't address the issue that was already there from decades before that. There's a second area in Pittsburgh that has done that. The Homewood area, which is not that far from the East End, it's right next to it. There's Larimer and Homewood. And they've also, it's the same thing basically has happened there. These were all houses that were used for redlining, and so they couldn't get mortgages. Some people, and you can see the buildings if you ever drive through that area, that some of these houses were magnificent. And it's right next to where an area of houses that were owned by wealthier people. And I mean wealthier people like Carnegie and some of the big names that were in the city of Pittsburgh that helped develop it. But Homewood also became deteriorated, and people couldn't afford to get mortgages. They couldn't afford to fix up their houses. And so there wasn't that familiar transference of money from having houses to sell or to give if somebody died to their family members. So it became much more depleted and a very low income housing area. They have been since trying to put some money back in. I think HUD actually gave them $30 million or $300 million to redo this area of Larimer. And I don't know how much has actually been done with that, because there's been a few places and buildings that have been redone, but not very many. And the same thing in East Liberty with the ELDI, they also were supposed to be helping, and they have not done that much yet for the redevelopment as far as lower income housing. So and as I said before, Larimer was actually Little Italy, they called it. But as the property has deteriorated, the people that were Italian moved out, and more Black people began to take over some of the houses. And without being able to get mortgages to redo the properties, it also began to get more deteriorated. So I mean, it's what did happen in Pittsburgh from like 1980s to 2000 was after the steel industry shut down, that a lot of people and what increased was the health system, was the universities, the CMU and Pitt, and a couple of smaller ones in Pittsburgh. And so education and the medical field really took over. And then what started happening around 2000 was the high-tech organization companies began to take over a section that's called Bakery Square. Bakery Square was a big industry of bakery, that people were manufacturing goods, and I forget the name of the company that was there before, but they turned that into a high-tech area. I mean, with restaurants and a big gym and high-rise, some apartment buildings, and including Google is there and various other ones. So that area got turned into, and that's right on the border between East End and Larimer. And that has not put any low-income housing in that area. So basically, I mean, Pittsburgh has not really come up to where they need to be in order to really fix, repair, and to help heal these communities. But there are some things that we all can do, and we can talk about that too. So it's been a very interesting historical experience. There's even another neighborhood called Lawrenceville that was mostly lower working class people. And there are a lot of row houses or townhouses that people come in and redevelop them. And these row houses, are now going for anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000. which is just outpricing everybody, right? Nobody can afford that if they're in a working class or lower income class. And so the same thing is happening in that neighborhood. It has been for the last 20 years.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the things for me, because as I mentioned, I didn't live here for so long,
Right.
and just coming back periodically, and then when I finally did come back, and the breadth of what had changed in the city is just it almost takes your breath away, right? But at the same time, because there's no investment in the people that are here. And so when you think about all the development and everything, so much of that development was people coming from outside of Pittsburgh and making their mark, so to speak, in the city of Pittsburgh, but at the same time displacing Pittsburghers.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so just kind of watching that happen, it was just very sad.
Well, it's very
sad. Yeah.
I think we're looking at really structural racism, that it's not just about bad planning. I think there was intentional purpose that was going on. Because even if you look at the East End, and one of the programs in the nonprofit I run, we had a day camp during the summertime and a couple of programs throughout the year. And it was in the East End where there was predominantly lower income housing and people that lived there. And over the last 5-8 years, gentrification has taken over. These houses are now going for $4, $5, $6 and up, $100,000. And most of the people and the kids that were going to our program are not even in the area anymore. Now we still, and our program had to have at least over 50% low income. So sometimes we had to start busing some kids in from other areas. And that's how much that area changed over the last 10 years.
And I was doing some research sort of on a different topic, but a related topic. And the idea of how prevalent it is just to be about monetization. Like everything has to be monetized. Everything has to, like, we're just not in a good place right now. And part of the issue is, like what you were just talking about, is when you have all this development stuff on this top layer that's very visible, but the part that's not visible is the redlining aspect. And people just have these ideas, Black people get houses and they can't take care of them and they can't do this and they can't do that. But then you got that invisible layer of redlining, which means I can't go and get a bank loan to improve my home. And then when the resources start pulling out, the people that are supposed to pick up our trash, as an example, don't come like they're supposed to. And so it really just kind of gets to a point where you're depressing the community more and more and more and more. And then you turn around and blame it solely on the community.
And it's not that at all. It really goes back historically to when redlining started happening and racism. Yeah.
I thought redlining wasn't legal anymore. What effect is it having now? Is it just...
Well, I think the banks still have those areas marked off.
Exactly.
As hazardous. They call them hazardous areas.
Yeah. And just think about what's happening
for banking.
Think about what's happening with the in Texas, with redrawing the lines and the districts and the redistricting and all of that, so that you minimize the power of the non-white population.
That's just a form of redlining. Right.
And the
government's doing it.
Absolutely. And it happens right now. So even though redlining, I just think it's just underground now. It's just not in our faces anymore. Right. But not only that, because of how extensive it was, the impact is still there.
That's right.
Well, it was
still there.
Right. It would have delineated where Black people could get homes
Exactly.
And they weren't in the areas where the banks would give loans.
Right.
So their property values were
Exactly.
depressed.
Exactly, because it was all
Yeah.
about manipulation.
Right.
So we got
Yeah.
the Black community over there, so that's going to be like a hazardous zone.
Right.
So people in the habit of, the business, I should say, of lending money for homes and investments and all of that, don't lend it to those people right there. That's what redlining basically said.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Don't lend it to those people. We've designated these communities over here as being hazardous and high risk. It's break time.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a break and we'll come back and continue the conversation. So welcome back to Inflection Point Podcast as we continue our 2025 journey into community engagement and the grassroots of change. In this particular episode, we are exploring community disengagement and gentrification in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I'm going to go back to Gail so she can finish out the last little piece that she wanted, and then we're going to flip the script a little bit.
Sure. There have been some things that people have been working towards trying to change this. That in groups like the Operation Better Block and Homewood Children's Village, they've also worked on trying to increase education and housing and community wellness. But the resources are uneven compared to foundation-backed projects elsewhere. So they're not getting and now they're not getting the kind of money that they need. The Homewood residents that frequently attend the city and foundation sessions, but they describe decisions as being predetermined or skewed towards outside investors. And then Pittsburgh Registered Community Organizations, or RCO, system formalizes neighborhood input via what is required by the development activities meetings. But capacity gaps, representation, and the fact that input can be disregarded and approvals undermine legitimacy and federal disengagement. Private investment, rising land values, tenant displacement, the spurred protests and litigation, the population change. It shows who's moving to Pittsburgh. The Pittsburgh Black population falls by 13.4%, indicating that benefits of growth have been uneven and displacement pressures are still very much real. And so the cost burden is widespread and racialized. So as much as we had the Fair Housing Act go through and it looks on the surface as if this is not happening, the reality is that it is happening. We've been watching this city, that how much it's happening. It's it's considered for women though one of the highest cities ranked to not live if you're Black, right. And for all the reasons that we were talking about. Yeah.
So one of the things that I want to mention, and then we're going to shift it over to Mavis. I'm sorry, to Mavis. And then she's going to talk a little bit about what would authentic engagement actually look like, or what would it look like if there was an anti-displacement movement, if you will, in the city of Pittsburgh. But I wanted to just kind of point out something that I've labeled as the Pittsburgh Paradox, right? Because at a certain point in time, I think it was somewhere between like 2005, 2018 or something like that, Pittsburgh was rated as one of America's most livable cities. Right. So that was that rating. But then at the same time, there was an article that I believe it came out in like maybe 2015 or so. And in that article, it was talking about Pittsburgh being America's 8th most gentrified city. And then Jerry Dickinson from the University of Pittsburgh law professor, wrote an article, I believe in 2021, in which Pittsburgh was viewed as America's apartheid city. So it sounds kind of nice and flowery when you got all of this stuff up here, but the reality is what's going on below the surface. And I think Pittsburgh is just a perfect example of all of these different experiences happening. And Gail talked about these specific neighborhoods, the Hill District, East Liberty, Hazelwood, Homewood. But each one of these communities experience displacement in a different kind of way, but the root cause is the same. Systemic racism, historical trauma, credibility gaps, inequitable planning, procedural participation, blah, 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 blah. I could go on and on and on, because of what it all boils down to ultimately is community disengagement. So at this point, I'm going to pass the mic over to Mavis, and she's going to talk about what could authentic engagement actually look like. And also when you couple it with deliberately couple it with anti-displacement, what could it look like in the city of Pittsburgh?
Would it be okay if I asked Gail a couple of questions about her report?
Yeah, sure.
What do we know what drew the tech industry to Pittsburgh? And my thought behind that is, if you gentrify a city, what usually draws companies to a city is a workforce, right? If you gentrify, you've basically pushed the workforce out of the city and they have to start commuting and their costs go up. So what was it that attracted the tech industry? Do you know?
I think that between Pitt and CMU, especially CMU, they offer degrees in high tech and robotics and so forth, and AI and
so they offered degrees and then were able to pay the people.
So a lot of people, to get them to stay in the city of Pittsburgh, they had to find places that they could use that would draw them. Baker Square was one perfect example, that it was a big warehouse and factory. And when that closed down, that's when they decided that they would take up that entire, and it's a huge area, and tear everything down around it and turn it into this high-tech place that is
so those
very
wage earners,
expensive.
hourly wage earners lost their jobs and had to move out because real estate is more expensive.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a double whammy, and
well,
it just
actually,
seems very predatory.
And it's a triple whammy.
A triple whammy.
You also have to recognize the fact that buying land in Pittsburgh was a lot cheaper than buying land in other cities.
Right.
Like, for example, when I left Pittsburgh, I had a beautiful apartment. I lived in this triplex. So it was a first floor. It was one house, but the people who owned it converted it into 3 apartments. I lived on the second floor. I literally paid $325 to live in that apartment. When I left and went to Princeton, I went from 325, looking at, things in that price range, all the way up to like $1,600 to live in something that wasn't even as good as what I had when I was in Pittsburgh. So you also have to look at what people coming from the outside, the developers, what they could get in buying the land. It just wasn't nearly as expensive as some other cities.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
And it just doesn't seem, I'm horribly biased on this, but it doesn't seem like the effect on the lives of the people that live there is really factored in.
No,
there's going to be
not at all.
We are going to develop this for you. There's going to be low cost housing, and that's not what happens.
Somebody that was paying
not at all.
$300 or $500 a month for rent now has to pay $2,000 a month for rent for the same place.
Exactly.
That's not factoring in anybody that has a pretty significant job and income.
I heard about one of the buildings in Manhattan that it might be one of the buildings whose name will not be mentioned, but they were requiring it to have a number of certain low income units. And the people in that building, because it was a prestigious address, didn't want to be seen coming in the same door with low income housing people. I mean, what does that say about us? What does that say about us? Anyway,
but quite frankly, it says the truth about us.
Right.
Yeah.
It says the truth about America.
Right.
That's exactly.
I'm better than you, and I don't want to live by you.
Yes.
Exactly.
I don't even want to know you. I don't want to be close to you so that I can know what your challenges are, or how we might be able to form a community.
And one of the other things, I'm going to let you go on after this, but I'll just make one final point also, is that when it comes to, this is my sense, I mean, it's not like I've sat down and had these long drawn out conversations with developers, but it seems to me that when developers come in from outside, especially if they're coming in from like a city like New York or Boston, like some of the, other bigger cities and things like that, and they bring those ideas with them. So they don't always even build something that is compatible with the local surroundings.
Right.
I mean, you think about a lot of the apartment buildings, Pittsburgh is a much more traditional town. So you go in some areas and the houses are flat out beautiful. Right. And then you'll have this beautiful home right here. And then you'll have this apartment building, to me, that looks like a file cabinet. Like you just pull out a drawer in your apartment. And so so there's like a mismatch between what the developers are doing and seeing and being in, because they're not interested in the community and being a part of that. Is driven more just by the money.
Right. And the money and the power. So just to recall our last podcast, it was about community engagement and really involving people in the community to give them a voice in what they wanted in the community. And not only that, to make sure that they were involved in the outcome, that they had some sort of skin in the game all the way through. So it's not just, we want your opinion and then we're going to do our own thing. We want to know what would make this community more livable. This disengagement idea is really, here's what's not, what we don't want to do. You had said, Anita, what would authentic engagement look like? And I'd like to add the word compassionate engagement. What are our decisions? How are those going to affect the residents? And can that engagement include an anti-displacement conversation that we can really deliver on? As investors, let's say, don't say what we're going to do to make this less painful for you unless we can deliver on it. So that would mean that economic power wouldn't be the only factor in redevelopment. There are other tools that residents can use to have a voice in these processes. But I don't know. I'm not seeing, I'm not hearing that this goes all the way to the end where residents do get to stay in or near the community that they've spent most of their lives in. I am not a Pittsburgh resident, so I can't really speak to neighborhoods like my two co-hosts here can. But here are some ideas on how we could work on some gentrification that protects residents and their connections to each other. When you think about gentrification, people are separated then. They're separated from their corner store, the guys they know by name where they buy their coffee and so on. Their local culture, who's got their shops there.
Yes.
Who do you know can, get this clean for you really quickly, a dry cleaner or something. I think that we have to consider those factors, as well as the capital that's needed to improve the neighborhood. So the idea would be to shift from just input from residents and to shared governance. We can tie large projects to what are called community benefit agreements with enforceable timelines, transparent dashboards, so the community can see what's happening, when it's going to happen, and so on. And third-party arbitration. One of the things I can imagine in this process is that if it's not happening, what weight do the residents have? What armor do they have that they can come up against these developers and say, I haven't had power for a month. You've disconnected power for this region. What is happening? So there's got to be constant communication between the contractors, the project managers, and so on, and the residents. The other key would be to stabilize where people live. Like I say, keeping those connections and those local feels of neighborhoods. Keeping small stores that people can grab food on the way home from work, that it's all about getting in your car, if you even have a car. One of the tools is to renew or expand housing opportunity funds out further into the future, to prioritize extremely low-income renters, permit affordability and acquisition and rehab to stem the loss of legacy rentals. I just remember living in Manhattan, how often you'd meet an older person that had lived in their apartment for 40 years. To me, Manhattan is a place where you go and live a couple of years, you survive and you get out. But these people, this is their home. And they have in New York City, rent stabilization that works in complex ways. But apparently Pennsylvania does not have any rulings where people can protect themselves against rent going up within the course of a lease, which to me seems completely egregious. There's another tool that could help would be to scale right to council coverage. So I understand that to mean these residents are going to need legal representation in these matters. And they're not going to be able to pay a lot of money. They're just fighting for their homes. So if there can be scaled arrangements for these people to be able to defend themselves, that would be key. Pro bono work, a firm or two supplying that. There need to be residential treatment programs developed elsewhere. They need to keep families housed. I can see where treatment facilities would become even more necessary as homes are disturbed and people are forced to live more, in smaller groups. A lot of times people, when they have had their homes for a long time, there are multi-generations in these homes. And now they're probably being forced to live in smaller places and so on, and different, having less or inaccessible access to these programs. There are things called community land trusts, which can provide for permanently affordable home ownership in areas facing appreciation. Now, I would love to know more about one or two of these land trusts. I've heard of that as a legal instrument, but not as a successful tool for residents, fighting against gentrification. Even in my town, I live in a small town in New Jersey. There's a major organization that wants to build a huge warehouse that would bring so much traffic and so many trucks into the area that it would just clog it up, ruin the roads, and so on. But my town is pretty, I would say, except for my house, they're well-to-do, and they have the means to recruit attorneys. There's a lot of attorneys who live here, and we're just fighting that. And I'm thinking, how lucky are we that we can fight that major change to our town? It would just destroy it. There are other things that can be offered for the developers themselves. One is called exclusionary zoning for affordable housing. Sometimes that can involve you give us a few affordable houses and we'll give you X, Y, or Z. As deals are made for those kinds of things. It could be a tax abatement, any number of things that would help the balance sheet of the developer. I don't know that necessarily offsets the trauma to the residents. But everything needs to be tracked and communicated in real time so that residents can know exactly what's happened. Without the communication, the trust is going to go. And there's going to be, I don't know how the rage is going to play out in various areas, but it doesn't need to happen this way. Maybe I'm just Pollyanna, been accused of it before, but just think of the blessing that could happen and the goodwill that companies could acquire from treating people, long-term residents, like human beings who have invested in the community most of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Think of what that could mean for other things that you may have to take, make this a negotiation, a real negotiation, and deliver on the things that you have promised the community.
Mm-hmm.
So,
if I could just jump in.
Jump in, girl. I'm going to.
Because one of the issues is the fact when particularly as I mentioned, when developers are coming from outside of the city that you live in, and so they don't really have that connection, if you will, to the community, the city,
culture
of that. And it feels like a lot of times when they come in and they might have a meeting with the community, or, we want to get to know the community, but it always ends up that it's more like, we already have this plan in place. This is what we're going to do. And we're telling you, we're just letting you know that this is what we're going to do. But there's no input from me because you came in with a plan. You didn't ask for my input at all when you were putting the plan together. Yeah. So now you're coming and you think you're doing me a favor because you're letting me know, oh, this is what we decided to do. You didn't ask me.
Yeah. And even if you did at some point, did you deliver on anything that
Right, exactly. Or did you just take notes on what I said? Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, and then you move on.
It's about manipulation, kind of from beginning to end, instead of really being about protection and respect.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And integrity, right? And authenticity.
One of the points I wanted to make here before I sign off is that gentrification in Pittsburgh is not new, of course. It's the latest chapter in a long history of disinvestment, removal, and broken promises. That's the long and short of it. And when people feel decisions are made over them, not with them, they disengage. So then what kind of community do you have? I would love to get in the mind of a developer who, does he or she think, I don't care if people move away, they can do whatever they want. I just would love to know what their thought process is. Absolutely. Because it's always more complex than,
what's
individuals like us coming to it and talking about it. So I gotta give a caveat.
We literally have about 4 minutes left. So I'd like to turn our conversation over to the audience. And if you're listening, here's one of the things that we challenge you to do. Wherever you are, whatever neighborhood you are living in, learn the neighborhood's history, right? Ask who lived there before and what was lost. For me coming in now in 2025, but what did it look like here 2020? So show a little bit of interest in the new neighborhood or the feel or the space that you're now starting to move into, and think about supporting some of those community-led solutions. Some of what you mentioned, community land trust, housing funds, tenant protections. Show up.
Residential.
Show up.
Community organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Show up at those meetings. Show up at city council meetings when they're talking about this stuff, right? Share this episode with a colleague or a community leader to help who might be ready to deepen their own equity. So the point is, Start a dialogue, talk about it, acknowledge that there's a history that is there. Before you came along, this thing looked like something else. Show some interest. Show some interest. So I'd like to leave us with this closing message. So this is our Pittsburgh affirmation, right? Reimagine we. We are the heartbeat of Pittsburgh, the living memory of resilience, the sacred inheritance of survival. We are more than data, more than plans, more than zones and charts and hearings. We are the people. We are the power. I affirm I am not disengaged. I demand to be heard. I am not displaced. I am rooted in memory and possibility. I am not forgotten. I am the founder, the builder of tomorrow. I am not powerless. I am community empowered. And so just kind of taking that type of message, and we always when we end, we tie it back to that original Cairo question. After all the conversations and stuff that we've had over the past 2.5 years or so, it still boils down to, will Cairo have to fight in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist and live where he chooses to live? Is it possible to imagine that kind of future that's free from the shackles of divisiveness and meaningless conversations? Can we do this? I say, yes, we can. But each one of us has to make a decision, a choice in terms of how they are going to move. What is your call to action going to be? So I'd like to thank you for listening to our podcast. And we're here every first and third Wednesday of the month on Transformation Talk Radio. And I thank you again for joining us for the latest episode of Inflection Point Podcast. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.